So we come to the afternoon keynote speaker, eagerly anticipated. I have absolutely no doubt. Some of you may know of Mark Pollock. You may have heard him talk before. Some of you may not have come across his remarkable story before. And if you haven't, you're in for an inspirational treat, I think is the way I would describe it. As we look ahead, if we're going to pull anything out of it, I suppose there are two things you could say we're going to need in the business world of tomorrow. As we talk about leadership and what the challenges are, we need to be resilient and we need to be collaborative. And our speaker, Mark Pollock, has demonstrated both of those traits. And he's going to share his story with us in just a moment. Let me give you a bit of background to Mark. He's been selected by the World Economic Forum as a young global leader, and his TED Talk has had nearly 1.5 million views and counting. He's been awarded honorary doctorates by the Royal College of Surgeons in Ireland and also by Queen's University in Belfast. He's raced to the South Pole, and he's co-founder of Run in the Dark, which is an event which happens in 50 cities around the world every November. There's an awful lot to say about Mark, and he's going to say a lot about himself in a moment or two. So just to introduce him and his story a little bit more, we have a short film for you, so take a look at this.
When I was young, I wanted to compete. When I went blind, I wanted to go further. Broke my back, I just wanted to walk again. I will. Back in the summer of 2010, I fell from a second-story window onto the concrete below. And I don't know how it happened. Nobody does. There was no one there. But I suspect I got up to go to the bathroom that night. And as a blind person, I used to use my hand to find the way. That particular night, my hand found an open space where the closed window should have been, and I cartwheeled out. And my friends who found me thought I was already dead. The doctors in intensive care suspected I was going to die, and when I realized what had happened, I wondered whether dying might have been the best outcome. I'd fractured my skull, I had 3 bleeds on my brain, massive internal injuries, and I couldn't feel or move anything from my stomach down. All of that added to the blindness that had happened 12 years earlier. Now, I'm sure you can appreciate that I didn't choose any of it. I didn't choose the accident, the injuries, the consequences. None of it was my choice, but I've come to make sense of it by acknowledging that sometimes we have the luxury of choosing the challenges that we take on, and sometimes challenges just choose us. It's the way it is. And rather than try and make some clunky link between the challenges of blindness and paralysis and the individual business challenges that you face on a daily basis, which might all be a stretch, perhaps where we can connect is around the decisions that we make in light of those challenges, the decisions that we make as human beings. So we're going to just look at 3 themes. The choice to be a spectator or a competitor, which is about mindset. The choice to be an optimist or a realist, which is all about facts. And finally, the choice to be a soloist or a collaborator. Now, just before lunch, I've been brought on as the kind of, the upbeat ending to the morning. and I am going to deliver some pretty deep insights into my area of world-class expertise, which is acquiring disabilities. So I think we're going to achieve that high here at the end of the morning. But I suppose the other thing is the only reason to bring a speaker in at all is so the audience are actually thinking about themselves. So the purpose of my story is not for me just to tell you the story, but I hope you're thinking about yourselves throughout. So I'm going to rewind back to 1998, 20 years ago, for this first theme, to be a spectator or a competitor. And in 98, I was just coming to the end of my degree in Trinity College in Dublin, studying for a business studies and economics degree and about to graduate. And after graduation, I was going to go and start a job in investment banking in London. And remember, we're time traveling back 20 years ago when it was nearly socially acceptable to say you wanted to be an investment banker. Not so much now, but more than a wannabe investment banker or a soon-to-be graduate, I was a sportsman, and I was rowing for the university and also for Ireland at the time. I was someone who knew exactly who I was and exactly where I was going, and in the space of 2 weeks, through detached retinas, that changed entirely. In a moment, I was no longer involved in university life. I was no longer someone with prospects of going and getting a job, and I was no longer involved in my crew anymore. In the space of 2 weeks, I not only lost my sight, but I also lost my entire identity. And it's this point about identity that I'm exploring with you here now on this decision theme, because I got a white stick and I got a guide dog called Larry, and I got a talking computer and a talking phone, all the kit I would need to go and start a job and go and do a master's. But really, the part of my identity that I had lost was my ability to race. I was excluded from that, and my desire to compete conspired to get me back in the boat with the potential prize of getting on the Northern Ireland team for the 2002 Commonwealth Games, which we duly did. And we travelled over to Nottingham, where the championships were, raced over 2 days, and eventually won silver and bronze medals in those particular championships, the open championships, as opposed to any sort of Paralympic type event. Now, it was a big deal for me at the time, a huge part of me rebuilding my identity, but the Commonwealth Games, particularly in rowing, is not it's not the World Championships, and it's not the Olympic Games. When you knock out all of the Commonwealth countries who don't actually do any rowing whatsoever, and then you also consider that Australia, the night before, got food poisoning throughout their entire team, and the mighty Northern Ireland were one step closer to the medals, So it was good, but it wasn't that good. And my desire to race continued, and I set off on a quest to be an adventure athlete, racing in deserts, mountains, and oceans, trying to rebuild my identity. And it wasn't really until the 10th anniversary of losing my sight that the opportunity arose to compete at a level that I had aspired to prior to going blind. And it came in the form of a 43-day expedition race in the coldest, most remote, most challenging place on Earth, in Antarctica. It was the first race to the South Pole since Scott and Shackleton and Amundsen set foot in that then uncharted desert at the start of the last century. And to be part of it, I would have to drag sledges on cross-country skis through crevasse fields for up to 16 hours a day. We'd be racing against Norwegian Special Forces and ex-British Royal Marines, people who had raced to the North Pole previously. And after 1,000 kilometres, I had the opportunity to not only get to the South Pole, but also be the first blind person to do so. And I simply had to be part of it. 10 years after going blind, a chance to rebuild my identity. It was hugely important to me at the time. And the person who had created the opportunity, a guy called Tony Martin, was also the same person who had the ability to deny my entry in the race or to make it happen. And Tony is he's a fierce sort of character of a man. He's an ex-British Royal Marine, and if you can imagine someone from the military, looks the part, he has a big military handlebar moustache, which is actually, I thought just lots of them had it, but it seems that when you pass lots of Arctic warfare drills and training and assessments, you're allowed to have this moustache if you do really well. And he speaks in sentences of no more than about 5 words in a really aggressive way. So I got on the phone to him to make my pitch and said, look, Tony, I want to do your race, and I've done 6 marathons in a week in the Gobi Desert. I've done the North Pole Marathon, the Everest Marathon, the Dead Sea Ultra, the Zurich Ironman. And I was going on to give him the rest of my CV, but he was demonstrating no interest whatsoever in my list of achievements. He was going, yeah. And I got the sense he was probably about to put the phone down. So I got my final word in, which was, Tony, I appreciate if you've got to check with your health and safety guys. It's just I'm also blind. And quick as a flash, he said to me, look, mate, there is no health and safety in Antarctica, and if you fall down a crevasse, you're going to have to rescue yourself, whether you're blind or not. So if you give me €150,000 and find 2 teammates willing to go with you, you're more than welcome to enter the event. And I transferred my €500 deposit that night, which has always been strange to me that they had a deposit at a level so low. Like, if you didn't get the balance, So anyway, it was a statement of intent, perhaps, and I, first of all, figured that the money might come along, but I had to get fit enough, and I had to find 2 teammates to go with me, or for me to go with them, more like. And I started with a guy that I could train closely with, a guy called Simon O'Donnell, who is an Irish guy, lives in Dublin, that I had done some kayaking with in the past. He's an absolute physical and mental hulk of a man. He had a big kind of adventurer, red beard and shaggy hair, really looked the part for the whole thing, but he had a rugby background, no polar experience whatsoever. And Simon and I started training for 6 months just to get a level that we could hold our heads up high when we travelled to try and find someone who actually knew what they were going to be doing. And we started by going on ski machines in the gym down in Dublin, back in Trinity, doing interval training on the ski machines, doing chin-ups and dips and press-ups. Even he had us doing handstand press-ups at one stage, which, if you ever go to a polar region, there's absolutely no benefit. But I suppose 10 years on, those handstand press-ups certainly would have made the social media channels, would have made the cut, But anyway, we were also dragging tyres around the beaches in Dublin Bay and in the mountains in Wicklow to try and model what it would be like to drag the sledges. And really what we were doing was just building up our strength, building up the confidence in each other and the trust in each other to eventually, hopefully, go to the South Pole. And we travelled to Norway to learn how to cross-country ski to begin with, to build up our cold weather experience, and to find a teammate who we found in the name of a guy called Inge Solheim, hugely experienced, our kind of secret weapon to add to our team, and to show you what it was like in Antarctica rather than tell you what it was like. We've got this little video, so let's play the South Pole video, please.
My main goal with this race, I've done quite a lot of adventure races, but I've always felt the reason why people pat me on the back is because I've done these things when I'm blind. I think this race is, regardless of the blindness, this race is challenging on its own, and I wanted to come and do something that was really inspiring regardless of the blindness.
It's nearly 1 o'clock in the morning and we're about to start our final 46 kilometers.
This race doesn't compare to the things that I've done before. It's been incredibly hard by anyone's standards. It's satisfying all of my ambitions and putting a lot of my blind demons to rest.
This week 10 years ago, I hadn't been out of the house by myself for 9 months. I was just about to make my first independent journey in Dublin. Little did I know that it would end up finishing at the South Pole 10 years on. It's just been an incredible adventure. I really feel like I can stand up in front of people now and say, I am an adventurer.
Good, Simon! We're about 20 metres. Well done, enjoy it.
Much better to see you.
That's the silver ball. That's the silver ball and that's the post that it stood on.
Brilliant, brilliant.
Well done, mate.
No, thank you. Thank you. That's very kind of you, but I feel I might have dragged that out of you if I showing you the video, you know. And the question, I suppose, is why have I shown you the video? If that was the end of the story and I moved on, there'd be no point in me telling you the story. So I want to rewind slightly to the money side of it. Now the 149,500 balance. I thought, now bear in mind I was doing economics and marketing in Trinity, so I should know how to gather that kind of money. And my first plan was to put a glossy brochure together, which we did, get it out to loads of companies with a massive appendix of all the slots on our kit and sledges that the company could put their logo. Now that failed after 6 months, and you know, looking back and as we analysed it, looked into it deeply, we realised that there was no audience in the polar plateau in Antarctica. You know, I mean, like literally, the penguins don't go into the middle of Antarctica because it's too cold. So they stay on the coast where it's nice and warm. You know, so we didn't get the money off a company. Or a collection of companies. And about 6 months in, you know, I've been talking a lot about it, as lots of you will know. You talk about things whenever you're trying to raise the money, and once you talk about things and promote them, then you're kind of already committed. I was starting to panic 6 months in, and I thought that if we wrote a book about it, we could put the logo on the front of the corporate logo on the front of the book and write about our wonderful corporate partnership throughout the narrative of the book, and we would surely get the 150,000 there. So I got onto the top 30 literary agents in London to try and secure a book deal. And I emailed all of them and got no responses, but didn't really expect to get a response. But I knew I'd have to follow up with the phone calls, and I started the phone jockeying and getting on to as many people as I could. And I eventually got through to one guy called Mark Lucas. And in talking to him, I kind of imagined him to be, you know, English literary type. I think he lives in Surrey or, you know, one of these places. I imagine him to be wearing cricket whites at all stages, polishing a cricket ball in his office. And he kind of, now I know him, he pretty much is like that. But anyway, I got on to him and I said, look, I'm going to do the first race to the South Poles in Scott Amundsen, Shackleton. There's a Norwegian-British angle to it, and of course in Ireland there's a polar history element with Crean, and Shackleton was born in Ireland. Surely you can get me a great publishing deal. And he said to me, well look, I do wish you all the best with your adventure, but I'm surprised you could put through to me because, as everyone in my office knows, there's nothing I find more boring than icy tales of people who go to the North Pole, South Pole, climb Everest, come back, write a book about it and inflict it on the rest of us. So I'll not be trying to get you a publishing deal, but I wish you all the best. Now, I thought at the time it was a bit harsh, a bit brutally honest, but he was absolutely right. He didn't get me a publishing deal, no one else did, so there is no book for me to hand out at the end of today's session, right? And we eventually got all the money from people, not from the big corporate, not from someone who wanted something out of it. We got all of the money from people who wanted to be on the team, but would never go to Antarctica themselves, 2,000s, 3,000s, 5,000s, 10,000s, right up to the wire until we eventually got the money. As every good adventure book was telling me, you don't get it at the beginning, you get it when you think you're just not going to get it. And we did. And I went off, got the video, came back, got invited on to BBC Breakfast Television in London, travelled over the week after we got back from the South Pole and told millions of people on BBC Breakfast Television about our great success. And I was walking out of the BBC studios at the time and I was checking my phone needily to see if anyone had seen me on TV, you know, for the emails, and there weren't too many. But there was an email from this guy, Mark Lucas. And I was thinking to myself, big mistake, pal, your big regrets, you've missed the boat, you know? And I clicked on it, my phone was reading back, and it said, Dear Mark, I've just watched you on BBC television, and I've got to tell you, I have not changed my mind. Which, you know, totally unnecessary to go to the trouble, I would have thought. But it's the next line that perhaps is important for this session, because what he said was, what was it really about? What was it really about? Now, I suspect that is the job of a literary agent, to know that it's about something else apart from the ice and the snow. And it took me to go down there and do the race and raise the money and spend the money and have the experience. Perhaps it took me 10 years of adventure racing to work it all out. But I discovered at the South Pole that really all I was doing was trying to feel normal again. And for me, normal means competing. It means being in the arena. It means being defined by my willingness to try. It means pursuing success and risking failure, and knowing that being a competitor has both of those things running together. For so long, particularly in the aftermath of blindness, I felt like I was going to have to be a reluctant spectator, sitting on the sidelines, not wanting to be there, not having the option to be in the arena. And I know now it doesn't have to be that way, either for the big strategic goals, the South Poles, the rebuilding the identity, or for the day-to-day stuff, the getting out of bed and just having a go. It is without doubt a choice to be a competitor or to be a spectator. And in the aftermath of the South Pole race, I felt unstoppable, to the point where I was so high on confidence that I asked my then girlfriend, who's very much anti-marriage, to marry me, you know. And after she said no the first time and said, would you ask me again in 6 months? And my ego was so battered, I thought, well, I said maybe not. So I asked her a second time, and eventually she said yes. Now, if you knew my fiancée now, you would realize that is really quite a big deal. That's how confident I was. And at the height of my confidence, thinking I was unstoppable, a month before our wedding, I fell out the window and had the accident. And I found myself in intensive care in Stoke Mandeville in England, in the National Spinal Injury Centre. And a few weeks into the experience, I was told by the senior psychologist in the hospital that hoping for a cure had proven to be psychologically damaging. And what I was hearing as I lay there in bed was that the formal medical system was suggesting that we should cancel hope in favour of acceptance alone. Yet, cancelling hope ran contrary to everything that I believed in. And I felt at the time lying there that I was really being challenged to pick between acceptance or hope. And as I lay there in the middle of the night, I needed to make sense of it. I needed to tease it out for myself. Maybe it was a response to the people who had been sending me good wishes. But I started to write a blog on that same phone that Mark Lucas had written to me on. A blog about how I should respond to this challenge. And I titled it Optimist, Realist, or Something Else, which is the purpose of this second story. How should we respond? Optimist, realist, or something else? And the first part of the blog questioned whether the stuff that I'm talking to you about today was simply a way of me making a living as a speaker and going off and doing adventure races, or was I really going to use these decisions, these principles, to deal with this very real challenge of adding paralysis to the blindness. And I remembered a book by Jim Collins called Good to Great that some of you may have read. And in the book, he talks about an Admiral Stockdale who was a prisoner of war at the height of the Vietnam War. He was incarcerated for 8 years, from the mid-60s through to the early 70s, tortured over 20 times, didn't know if or when he might get out. And by all reasonable measures, his story was bleak. But he survived. And what Jim Collins was interested in was who were the ones who didn't survive, who didn't make it. And Stockdale explained that the ones who didn't make it were the optimists, because the optimists kept saying, we'll be out by Christmas, and Christmas would come and go, and then it would be Christmas again, and they still wouldn't be out. And when it didn't happen, when the best case scenario didn't play out, it was the optimists who became disappointed, demoralized, and many of them died in their cells. And as I was writing this blog, I was trying to work out how I should respond to this challenge. And I think Stockdale was a realist. Stockdale managed to survive by confronting the brutal facts of his current circumstances while maintaining a faith that he would prevail in the end. And to show you what it was like in hospital in the weeks and months after I wrote that blog, we've got this next little video, so let's play that, please.
I've never seen so many machines wired up to one person in my life. Wow, this is serious.
You had a very hard fall. Chances are you will be a paraplegic. What you don't start getting back within 12 weeks, you're probably not going to get.
One must be realistic, but at the same time you tend to err on the side of optimism, hoping that maybe something strange will happen and maybe Marsh legs will move.
I can't seem to make any progress forward, so I've thought about going on or just being easy or not. Stick how it happens.
When I left, I wasn't sure I would see him again.
And he said, you know, Mum, I don't think I can do this anymore.
So over time, I came to accept the diagnosis, the paralysis. I accepted the wheelchair. It's almost impossible not to. And I accepted that the combination of blindness and paralysis was going to mean that it was going to be pretty difficult without support just to get out of the house in the morning. But in confronting the brutal facts, I also had to accept that the brain injury cleared up, my arms work, I'm surrounded by great people, I do have opportunities ahead. So as a realist, I accept all of these things, but I also hope for something more. I also hope for a life where we've created a cure through collaboration that we're actively working on, that I'll speak about in a minute. But at the end of the blog, I don't really think I totally understood what Stockdale was talking about, and I do now. I think he was simply suggesting that the optimists rely on hope alone, and if the best case scenario doesn't play out, they become disappointed and demoralized. The realists, on the other hand, which sounds a little bit like, less positive, somewhat negative. The realists managed to confront the brutal facts and keep faith alive. The realists managed to run acceptance and hope in parallel. It's not about either or. It's about running them in parallel. And I suppose if the combination of these two first decisions, deciding to be a spectator or a competitor, and deciding to be an optimist or a realist, are about us as individuals. The third one is about the people that we work with, our teams or our networks. And the final theme is about deciding to be a soloist or a collaborator. Now, in hospital and over the following weeks and months and years, I discovered that for me and many other people, spinal cord injury strikes at the heart of what it means to be human. It turned me from my upright running, jumping, cross-country skiing form into a seated compromise of myself. And I discovered that it's not just the lack of feeling and movement, it also interferes with the body's internal systems, which are designed to keep us alive. Nerve pain, spasms, high doses of medication, time in hospital, shortened lifespans, all these things are common. And that's even in the best parts of the world with the best supports. But in a way, all those things are manageable. What I became interested in, and what I found really strange, was that up to this point in history, it had proven to be impossible to find a cure. Yet, history is filled with accounts of the impossible made possible through human endeavour. The kind of human endeavour that had taken those polar explorers to the South Pole at the start of the last century, and the kind of human endeavour that will take a new wave of explorers to Mars in the early part of this century. And inspired by those stories of exploration, I started asking myself, well, why can't that same human endeavour cure paralysis in our lifetime? And we had to find people like the Shackletons and Amundsons. We had to find people who were at the fringes. And we started to leave Ireland, we started to go to the UK, Japan, Switzerland, and across to America to find people working at the fringes. And we found two groups in particular. One, a group of robotics engineers in San Francisco at a company called Exobionics, building robots to allow people to stand and walk. And another group of scientists at UCLA in Los Angeles using electrical stimulation of the spine to promote and allow for voluntary movement. And we started to work with them, we started to build relationships with them separately. And to give you a sense of what all that looks like, we've got this little video, so let's play the final video, please.
I don't want to be stuck in a wheelchair for the rest of my life. The goal is to try and walk. If I lay in bed or just sat in my wheelchair, I'd be giving up completely. I know that the fitter and stronger I can get, the more chance there is that I will be successful to trial a set of robotic legs.
It's good to be back.
Okay, 1, 2, 3.
Way.
Whoa.
So what do you think?
Yeah, really.
How's walking?
Great, yeah.
Stepping out.
We need a bigger room.
The mission now is to connect physical exercise guys, the technology and robotics people, and the scientists.
How you doing?
Great to see you.
Good to see you. Go. Good.
Oh, yeah. Go on, Mark. Go on. Go. Wow. Well done.
Good.
It's really exciting. It's ridiculous. It is it, really.
So that was Simon at the end there, and she was getting extremely excited about the moment when I was able to voluntarily move my left leg whenever the Russian guy was saying go, go, go was electrocuting my spine. And she was a bit disappointed whenever I wasn't jumping for joy, because I was immediately thinking, well, this is good, but unless we all regress as human beings just to be in the business of moving our left legs, then it's only a start, but a good start nonetheless. And that early experiment led on to a working relationship with scientists in UCLA and Houston Methodist Research Institute with scientists over there, and now a group in Long Island. But I was working with those the electrical stimulation group, also with the robotics group, making great progress. And what started to become clear was that what so often seems to happen in science and technology is when people are really working on something groundbreaking, they tend to become very focused, necessarily focused on their work. They don't have the time or space to look sideways. And both of those groups knew about each other, of course they did, but they hadn't had the time or inclination to get together yet. And making those connections seemed to be where we could contribute. And so in 2014, we made our first breakthrough into creating these collaborations between these and with these two groups of scientists. And in 2014, I moved with my robot and Simon and my paralyzed legs to UCLA for 3 months. And every morning, the scientists put electrodes onto the skin of my lower back, pushed electricity into my spinal cord. And as they did that, and as I walked in my robot, I was able to voluntarily move my legs. And as I did more with my legs, the robot intelligently did less in real time. And over that 3-month period, I started to rebuild my muscles. I could feel them around the bones in my skeleton, in my legs. And my heart rate for any runners started to hit levels that I hadn't seen since I became paralyzed. I was able to train between 140 and 160 beats a minute during those training sessions. I was lucky enough to become the first person in the world to combine those two technologies and help the scientists publish papers to get more money to do more work. And Simon, who was getting particularly excited, she started to frame this whole thing like the moment when Tony Stark plugged the mini arc reactor into his chest and he became Iron Man, Now, we're not quite there, but we are in the human enhancement space. We're combining electrical stimulation, robotics, EEG headsets, virtual reality, biofeedback. We're talking to a group around nerve bridging and stem cells, optogenetics, another thing which is incredibly interesting, but some way out in the future. We are in the human enhancement space. We're at the intersection where humans and technology collide. And if you park the paralysis for a moment, it's been probably definitely the most exciting period of my life. But the point of this story is to highlight that up to this point in history, finding a cure has not been possible. Set against a backdrop of fragmentation in the system, brilliant people working in brilliant isolation, there will be no cure in that context. However, there are enough people working at the fringes, making brilliant breakthroughs, and by bringing them together, by creating those collaborations, there is a chance that we will cure paralysis in our lifetime. And what we have been doing is not raising 10 million as a research fund or 100 million as a venture philanthropy fund, which were options that we did look at. But instead what we've been doing is telling the stories of the scientific breakthroughs, allowing those stories to get us in the door of new labs, in with investors, in with investment bankers, in with venture capitalists, and eventually we raised a $5 million investment fund simply by connecting a company, a scientist, and a group of investors. We will make the breakthrough through collaboration, but we've got to get everyone to make that choice. Now, I'm going to get you to close your eyes for a moment, and I'll just finish up before we may do some questions. So if you close your eyes and remember at the beginning, I said that sometimes we have the luxury of choosing our challenges, and sometimes challenges choose us. What we decide to do about it, that's what counts. And I've suggested 3 things. We can decide to be spectators. I recommend that we decide to be competitors. We can decide to be optimists, but I think the liberating place is to be a realist. And we could also decide to concentrate on our own part of the jigsaw. We could decide to be soloists, but I think for the really big breakthroughs, we really have to decide to be collaborators. Thank you. Thank you. Thanks. Now, of course, there are a couple of things going on here. I don't know, with the running over of time, whether I should be doing questions, and no one can signal that to me.
I can tell you, Mark, that you didn't run over time, you ran under time, so that was good. If you want to do some questions, there's 5 or 10 minutes to do that, and I would have thought that will probably have provoked some thought. So, are you happy to take a few questions?
Yeah. You might, if you raise your hand, it'll be useful for Mark, not me.
Yes. Well, let's see just if anybody wants to dive in. I think we certainly had microphones. I don't know if we still have, but under the circumstances, if we don't have them, we do have them. There they are. Okay. Anybody want to just pick up off the back of that with a question or with a comment for Mark? If there's anything you want a little bit more detail on, because there's a heck of a story in 35 or 40 minutes there. So there's somebody just up on the right-hand side with a...
Thank you very much for sharing your story. I think there's a lot of people in the room who have been at certain places in their life where they had to pick. And we're all here, and everybody goes through challenges, so thank you very much for doing that. When you are an entrepreneur and in business, and I am a business consultant, so I'm sitting here going, oh gosh, I'm actually such a spectator. And I'm glad you've carried so much of your sense of humour through these periods of your life, which is very essential, both obviously in your challenges and as a business leader as well. And just, obviously when you take them decisions, I think now you're like an entrepreneur as well, is that safely saying? And it is that kind of like when you're sitting on a fence and you know what you have to do. And it is that, we talked this morning, I think was very valuable, and the first speak from IKEA, from Remco, was about that inner trust. And it's not talked about enough. And I've worked had the privilege of working quite a lot over the world, and I find locally here sometimes we just don't trust ourselves enough. And if you can give us some examples at that time where you had to dig that deep, and give us examples that would encourage us, maybe for me to get off that fence that I'm talking about.
Yeah, it's a funny one because it depends what level we're talking about. You know, we're talking about on a day-to-day basis, on the small stuff, or we're talking about the grand plan, the grand strategic plan, and I think it doesn't really matter what level we're talking about. These decisions happen on a daily basis or on an annual planning session. But I'll just, in answer to your question, I think the Stockdale thing has been, I think it must be why it came back to me when I was pumping myself full of morphine in intensive care at the worst of times. I think the point about focusing on the brutal facts, focusing on the brutal facts, as Jim Collins talks about, when you hear brutal facts, there's a bit of a sense of negativity around that. But in fact, very often, if we're really honest with ourselves, there are a handful of tough things going on, but then so often we don't really acknowledge all of the great things and some of the indifferent stuff as well. So if you're really being a Stockdale realist and confronting the brutal facts, it is imperative to not only list the negative but also acknowledge the positive. And maybe that speaks to your point about trusting ourselves to move forward. And I think the foundation is really dealing with all of the facts.
Thank you very much. Great question. Mark, thanks very much indeed. There's someone just right in the middle, about the 4th row back. We'll just get Leo to sprint over with a microphone. Thank you. It's making its way.
Thank you for a very inspirational talk. There was a wonderful little clip in your video where you said, when you were talking about identity, and you said, I can actually say now I am an adventurer.
Oh, yeah.
Which really touched me. And I guess my question is around, with everything else that you've done now, and when we think about ourselves in business and someone says, who are you and what do you do? How do you articulate that identity now? What would you say about yourself?
Yeah, well, it's I have a range of making up job titles because but maybe I'll tell you the job title in a minute. But you know, I think I was pretty comfortable post blindness with the. You know, I was a speaker and an adventure athlete because all of the things that I did were races. You know, I wasn't. You know, I thought blind explorer at that point might have been a stretch, you know, because it would have had to been following along, holding on to someone's elbow. It's not exactly exploration. So I was a sportsman. I was an adventure athlete and speaker back then. Now, I've had a lot of soul searching to say, well, I can't be an adventure athlete anymore because I tried. I went to Norway. I had a hand bike and I was going to do a race, but which was thankfully cancelled. It was going to be in Siberia, and I think my legs would have frozen. But on that training session, I realised I'm not going to get anything out of this because I'm not going to be competing. No one else is on a hand bike. No one else is blind and paralysed. I'm just there as a sort of novelty act. So I wasn't getting what I got out of the races. And as I have found myself now in a position where I can contribute to finding a cure for paralysis, which has never been done before, which is a new frontier. I, in fact, do now have my Instagram as Mark Pollock Explorer. That's a slight plug and an answer to this question. So on my website, I think I've got Explorer and Collaboration Catalyst, because that's kind of what I do now. A big focus is to try and get in the middle, do the work, turn up in the gym, turn up in the lab, consistently offer myself up as a guinea pig, and through that credibility, we can have conversations with lots of different people and bring them together to move the thing forward. So I probably should put speaker, explorer, and collaboration catalyst. As I said, it's a makey up title.
But it's a good one. It's a good one, and it's a great question. Let me just ask you this. What do you get out of an event like this? Do you draw some kind of energy out of speaking at a conference like this?
Well, I like to hear the questions for a start, and then I like to have the one-on-ones afterwards, because then you get, well, more in a big corporate, you know, because you probably get it as well with stuff you do, Mark. Like, you know, there's a big emphasis often at a large corporate event, and you know, everyone's saying, you know, we're one big team, or whatever. It's a good one. And then you speak to people one-on-one. There is no one big team. There are at best factions, you know. So, but I think that then reveals something about the organisation. So basically, I get the opportunity to, you know, I get to tell my story, but I kind of know my story, so I like to hear the questions, and I like to hear the conversations afterwards. Yeah, I do like that. Okay,
good. Well, that's interesting to hear what you get out of it, because it's always, you know, the best exchanges are two-way processes, aren't they? Where you give something and you get something back as well.
Well, you know, and the other thing I get is very often I get to do my talk, and depends who's in the room. Sometimes someone comes up afterwards and says, "Look, I know someone who's doing X, Y, and Z. I know someone who's interested in that area." You know, and I get to meet people that contributes to the work. So maybe, you know, the ethics of getting paid to talk about yourself so that you can then raise more money or do more things is questionable, right?
That's okay. It's a shop window as well, and you might as well take everything that you can.
And you plug your Instagram twice.
Yeah. Exactly. Okay. Anything else? There's just over on the left-hand side, gentleman there.
Hello, Mark. Thank you for your story. It's absolutely amazing, and we kind of think of ourselves and our own challenges and how they seem dwarfed beside yours, and your approach to them. It always reminds me of a line I read by a speaker one time, and I'm sure you've heard this before, how we could be ourselves without our delights, but it's our setbacks, our challenges, that's our identities are really hewn from. And with that there, my actual question is, what sort of setbacks and challenges in the collaborative response did you find? Because a lot of people in the industry find that when they try to bring people from different sectors together, there can be a lot of bounce back. And I'd like to know more of your experience from trying to pull things together and be the catalyst, like you say.
Yeah, it's, I've become, what wasn't on my blog, the Optimist Realist or something else one, I didn't used to talk about collaboration much at all, because in the sporting context, from, you know, if you're not doing the training and you're not doing the scores, someone else takes your seat in the boat, or, you know, you're happy that someone else has gone and a faster person is in if you're already on the team. So the sporting context is in fact, I would have been focusing much more on competition, which is very much a win-loss situation. And I still think that's important. I still think being competitive frames performance. You know, I want the best scientists in the world being brilliant at what they do, but in the science context, and we're working with some scientists who are the only people in the world who have that piece of technology. So we have to work with them, and they, you know, they may not want to work with me. But I've recently been listening to a podcast series by a guy called Adam Grant, who's an organizational psychologist, and the podcast called Work Life. And just at the tail end of one of his podcasts, he has an FBI hostage negotiator, a guy called Chris Voss, speaking. And I've just been listening to it coming up this morning. I've been trying to sort of understand it. You know, it wouldn't necessarily, hostages and negotiation isn't necessarily my sort of area of expertise, but he did articulate that even in a hostage situation, in a terrorist situation, whenever there's dialogue going on, humans deal with humans. And the scientists, technologists, investors, you know, everyone's a human, everyone's wired the same, but too often everyone's looking after themselves. So the scientists are trying to publish more papers, get their name at the top of the paper so they can publish the paper, so they can be first, so they can get more money into their lab. The investors are just thinking about their return. The patients are just thinking about getting fixed. You know, everyone's got their own agenda. So the collaboration piece is the hardest part in everything that we're doing, and what we're trying to do all the time is find a way where everyone involved can see a way that they get something out of it themselves. So they might get, you know, the robotics company coming together with the electrical stimulation company is interesting for both of those organizations, because the robot just moves you. It's not a cure device, it's a rehab device. With the electrical stimulation embedded, it turns it from a movement device into a cure device. The electrical stimulation company on its own, struggling for money, struggling to get investment, putting that together with a company with the scale that the robotics company has is attractive to them, because as a partnership they can do more than they could as two sets of individuals. So I will know more after I learn to become an FBI hostage negotiator, but I actually think that would be the most beneficial thing that I can contribute to this space. I mean, even the foundations who are the Reeve Foundation, Wings for Life, all these foundations that we're involved with, they're incredibly protective of their brand. And at the competition level, everyone's looking after themselves, even in their organizations. But if you elevate the game, up to curing paralysis, then there's a way of finding space for all of these different brands to come together and still get something out of it. But I better pause there. Fragmentation is the thing that is stopping progress in this space, and I think it's the thing that's stopping progress everywhere. I mean, we see it in our own political system here. We're seeing it in America. We're seeing it with Brexit. Collaboration is the key, so I'm going to be concentrating on that more over the next couple of years. I better stop there. I could go on about this.